So folks, as you pile back in, I will start answering your super chat questions. So yeah, I just had to kill the stream there for a couple minutes, but I am now back. This happens every so often. And that's okay. It's good to do things in two parts. You know, that's the risk when I do these things during the day. At night, I can generally just stream and no one interrupts. But sometimes during the day, you have to kill the stream for a little bit. So here I am, and I am back. I had to kill the stream for a few minutes, but I'm back. Someone could please post the link in the chat for the other stream. That would be great. I'll be posting the link when I edit these afterwards. Still got plenty of unnamed diet beverage. Glad you all have found your way back onto the stream. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's gather everyone around. Come on, folks. Come on back. Come on back. Come on back. Now I get to answer your super chat questions now that we did the roll call. So now I answer your super chat questions, and then we're done for the evening. And I've got all of your super chat questions written down, and you can keep the super chats rolling in if you want. I mean, I can just keep them coming, right? That's how this works. So if you have more super chats, by all means, just keep super chatting. Thank you for being patient and waiting for me. So the first super chat question I got: did I see Jason's video on Cuba privatizations? No, I did not. And I don't really want to. Jason's understanding of what socialism is and mine are very, very different. Jason does not think China is socialist. At one point, I don't think Jason thought Cuba was socialist. I think he thought they were revisionists. He certainly doesn't think Libya was socialist. So what he and I think about what socialism is vastly different. So his analysis of what's going on in Cuba and mine are probably going to be quite different. Does the hood exist abundantly? Where is the rock coming from? Why do so many white mans think it's the black man's fault? I don't even know what that means. I really don't know. I really don't know what you're asking about. The rock, and I don't understand that one. That's a super chat. I usually write them down. I just don't understand the question. What is the rock? Why do people think it's the white man's fault? You lost me there, man. You lost me. Heroin. Is that referring to heroin? Is that what that is? Okay. So the post was about the origins of heroin. Forgive me. I'm not up on everything. No, the rock is crack. Okay. Where does crack come from? All right. Crack's origins. All right. We'll talk about crack's origins. Sorry. I just didn't understand what the post. All right. Well, I'll definitely talk about that. Thank you for the super chat, and I'm glad to answer it. All right. No, I don't want to see Jason's videos on Cuba privatizations. And it's going to be a vehemently different view than mine. And I like Jason. I think Jason's a good guy. But we don't agree with each other on quite a few things. And so I feel like that video, I haven't seen it, and I don't even know what he says in it. But I assure you that what he says is vastly different than what I think. All righty. McCarthyism. Good resources on McCarthyism. Well, there's a lot out there. First of all, I would recommend a book by William Z. Foster called In Defense of the Communist Party and Its Indicted Leaders. William Z. Foster wrote this book, this short little pamphlet explaining the Communist Party's position at the time they were charged with conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government. It's a very good pamphlet, and it goes into detail about their positions at that time, the history of the Communist Party. It talks about why they don't advocate violence. It talks about the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. It talks about Spain and fascism. It's a very, very good piece of writing. So I recommend that. In terms of memoirs of the McCarthy era and what it was like to live through, it's interesting. There's a writer by the name, I actually read, there's a writer named Howard Fast. Howard Fast, he wrote, he was a novelist who was in the Communist Party and lived through McCarthyism. Howard Fast. And he wrote a book, a memoir, an autobiography called Being Red. And it was his memoir about what it was like to be a member of the Communist Party at the time that McCarthyism was going on. That's pretty good. There's another book that is very good that I recommend, and it's called Black Radical by Nelson Peary. And Nelson Peary was an African-American man who was a leader of the Communist Party. And he was in the Communist Party right after World War II. When he got back from World War II, he joined the Communist Party, and he went underground during McCarthyism. He lived under a false name and was hiding from the government. And he later went on to start the Maoist movement, not single-handedly, but he was part of the Communist Labor Party eventually. And his autobiography, there's 2 volumes of it. The first one is called Black Fire, and that's about his childhood in the 1930s, depression. And then the sequel, the follow-up, is called Black Radical. Black Radical is very, very good, and he talks about what it was like to be an African-American leader of the Communist Party, what it was like to go underground during the McCarthy era. It's very, very good. I actually have the honor of having met some older communists who lived through McCarthyism. And even though this wasn't a question, even though you were asking about books, which I did just recommend some books, I want to talk about that because people don't seem to realize how bad things were, right? And I've told people about McCarthyism and how bad it was, and people don't believe me. I mean, I talked to people who lived through this, people who remember this. Right? One aspect of McCarthyism that I heard I heard this from communists who were communist organizers in Youngstown, Ohio. They were in the steel mills. And they were Trotskyites. They were not in the main Communist Party. They were in the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1950s. They talked about how at the Youngstown Public Library, during McCarthyism, they put all of the communist books behind the counter. They had a certain section in the public library in Youngstown for what they called subversive books. And these books that were considered subversive, you could still check them out, but you had to go up to the librarian and ask for them. And then the librarian would write your name down. And there was a very good chance the FBI might come to your house a couple weeks later and say, why were you reading that Karl Marx book? Are you a communist? Are you a subversive? All over the country. All over the country. They would track in the public library who checked out Marxist books, who went behind the counter and looked for Marxist books. And that was done all across the country. I tell this to people, and people say that's not. No, ask librarians about it. My mother was a librarian. She'd studied library history. This happened. This was factual. This did happen. It didn't happen everywhere. It was up to the local city to do it. They didn't have to do it. But many major cities, many local towns and municipalities, they kept track of who asked for the Marxist books behind the counter at the library. This was in the 1950s, the early 1950s, late 1940s. And that information might get handed over to the authorities. In Youngstown, the local communists, they formed their own library, basically. They had a library in someone's home, so that if one was interested in Marxism, one could go to their home, and one didn't have to risk going to the public library and getting possibly written up by the FBI just for reading Marxist books. Another example of McCarthyism. This was an example, and I sat next to this woman when I first joined the Marxist group I was in. I was a college student. I was 19. Somebody in the group who lived in Detroit was driving from Detroit to Buffalo, New York. So they picked me up, and I went in their car, and we drove up to Buffalo, New York. And we went to visit a woman who was in her 80s. We sat down next to this woman who was in her 80s. She got out the photo album. She showed us the pictures from the bad old days, from McCarthyism. Books today. She told me it's gonna be hard for me to not start crying talking about some of this stuff, but you don't know how amazing these old communists were. Okay? We have all these boomers from the 60s, we have the modern day synthetic left, but these older communists, these greatest generation communists, born in the 1930s, born in the 1920s, these were some really special people. They're all dead now. And you don't know how amazing these human beings were. These were people who believed in communism with all their heart and soul, dedicated their lives to it, and went through hell for their beliefs in communism, and made huge sacrifices, lost jobs, went to prison. You don't know how amazing these people were. And what they were connected to was not the synthetic left. It wasn't a 1960s rock and roll concert doing drugs. These people were connected to a real communist movement. It was tied to the really existing Soviet Union. And I mean, you don't know. It'll be hard for me to not start crying when I talk about this, but I'm going to talk about it. The story, we went to this old woman's house in Buffalo. She got out the photo album. And in the photo album, she showed us pictures. Youngstown, and not Youngstown, but Buffalo's a steel manufacturing town. A lot of steel manufacturing there. And the Steelworkers Union, you have to remember, was started by communists, right? The National Steel Strike was led by William Z. Foster. Gus Hall and William Z. Foster and other Communist Party leaders started the Steelworkers Organizing Committee that eventually created, so it was communists who created the Steelworkers Union, United Steelworkers, USW. That was created by communists. And one thing that happened was in the 1948, the steel company fired every worker who was a member of the Communist Party. Every single worker in the steel mill, there was thousands who worked in the steel mills back then, fired every steel worker who was in the Communist Party. Fired him. So then, the next day, there was a protest outside the steel mill by communists, by civil libertarians, the ACLU, other people, protesting, saying that steel workers have the right to be part of whatever political party they want, Republican, Democrat, Communist, Socialist, whatever. And what happened then was the local FBI came and took a picture of the demonstration, figured out everyone at the demonstration, and printed in the newspaper, in the daily newspaper, printed the names and addresses of every single person at the demonstration. Their name and their address was printed in the Buffalo daily newspaper. This woman that I spoke to talked about how the FBI came to her house. Wanted to talk to her. She was a teacher at the time. They came to her school, and she got fired from being a teacher for being a communist. She got another teaching job. And again, the FBI came to her school. She got fired for being a communist. So then she got a job at a phone company. And when she got the job at the phone company, the FBI showed up. And the phone company said, "You're not going to talk about communism on the phone." The phone company didn't care that she was a communist, so she kept her job. That happened. Another story that I heard from older folks who lived under McCarthyism was that, during the Korean War, when the United States killed millions of people on the Korean Peninsula to try and, destroy the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, there were a few protests against the Korean War. Not many, because of McCarthyism, because the country was in an anti-communist hysteria. But one thing that happened was that in New York City, the Young Communist League, which was an underground illegal organization, organized a group of people to gather in Times Square wearing suits and ties. Just gather, just like anything. And then someone gave the signal. They shouted the code word. And immediately they unfurled a banner that said, U.S. troops out of Korea. And almost immediately, a line of cops came and just started beating them up. And so then they broke apart. And they went one square down. They went to Madison Square, 34th Street. And again, all silent, all standing there, wearing their suits and ties, looking like nothing. Someone shouted the code word, and then they unfurled the banner again, U.S. troops out of the Korean Peninsula. And then almost immediately, a row of cops came and started clubbing them and beating them up. So then they went down to Union Square. And again, they did this, and they did this all the way down to Foley Square. And a number of people were beaten up and sent to the hospital. People did prison time for subversive activity. People did prison time, months in jail for that demonstration. because it was promoting communism. It was, again, people think that McCarthyism was just Hollywood. That's what people think. People think McCarthyism was a bunch of Hollywood actors got dragged in front of a committee or something. No, it was a lot more than that. It was a lot more than that. There were a lot of everyday people who really suffered during the McCarthy period. Couldn't work, couldn't get a job. It was an awful, awful moment. And, you get a crazy narrative. So many times I would hear about McCarthyism. I'd be in school and they'd be telling us about McCarthyism. And I would hear this line, and it always annoyed me when I would hear this. It always annoyed me. Is people would start talking about McCarthyism. And they would say, there were some, good people who got in trouble with McCarthyism. I'd be like, excuse me? They'd say, oh, yeah, I heard there was an actor who just, he took communism, he took a Marxist class when he was in college, and he lost his job. Isn't that a shame? Or another thing I would hear is, there was one person who had just, for 3 weeks, they'd had a subscription to the Daily Worker, and they could never work in Hollywood again, or they lost their job as a college professor because they, for 3 weeks, had a subscription. Isn't that awful? Well, you're missing the point, okay? You're allowed to be a communist. Right? The United States government says, right, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. So it's not some good people got hurt. No, you're allowed to be a communist, right? Yes, there were many people who had just some spurious, random relationship, and their political enemies used that, against them. But there were a lot of people in McCarthyism who did believe in communism with all their heart and soul, and who did nothing but exercise their freedom of speech and their freedom of assembly and their freedom of association and join the Communist Party of the United States, an organization that did not advocate the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, but instead advocated a peaceful democratic transition to socialism and friendship with the Soviet Union and China and the countries around the world that were struggling for freedom. And there were a lot of people that because of that, had their lives destroyed. There was a concert in upstate New York, Peekskill, New York. There was a concert. The Communist Party had a concert, in a park in this upstate New York town. And a mob of people from the Ku Klux Klan and the American Legion mobilized and attacked the concert. And people lost their eyes. People were injured. McCarthyism was an absolute nightmare. And one thing about McCarthyism, again, that people don't talk about, is one of the main targets was the civil rights movement. The black freedom struggle. Because what did the Communist Party do? They fought for black people's rights. Paul Robeson, probably the most famous African American at the time. He'd been in movies, he'd been on Broadway, he was a musician who was widely loved. Paul Robeson was dragged before the House Un-American Activities Committee. What else? The Civil Rights Congress, which was an organization that fought for black civil rights and against the death penalty and would supply lawyers to free, African Americans who were accused and facing, the Jim Crow courts. They were targeted. They were viciously, viciously targeted. When Martin Luther King started his civil rights marches, 1954, you had the Montgomery bus boycott. What did all the news media say? This is a communist conspiracy. The civil rights movement is a communist plot. That was the line, right? You can look at the protests. Look at some of the video, the protests that went on. The right-wingers, listen to them all be interviewed. Race mixing is communism. It was widely known that the communists fought for black people, and so they accused Dr. Martin Luther King of being a communist. He wasn't one. He later, in his final years of his life, he started advocating social democracy, democratic socialism, but he never became a Marxist. He was never a Communist Party member. But that was the target. McCarthyism was very, very awful. It was very, 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 very awful. In 1951, again, look this up. If you don't believe me, look this up. In 1951, they passed a law called the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1951. That was a law that said in a time of national emergency, if the government declared a national emergency, there would be a list of 2 million people. 2 million people assembled by the U.S. government, the Justice Department, 2 million people associated with subversive organizations who would be rounded up and placed in concentration camps. They had a law to put people in concentration camps. A U.S. government law, the McCarthy Internal Security Act, was passed to put people in concentration camps if they, in a time of national emergency. If you were a Communist Party member, and the Communist Party was never 2 million people, so if you were a Communist Party member or one of the 2 million on that list, in a national emergency, you went to a concentration camp. Now, no, McCarthyism was very, very, very extreme, and it was very, very awful. No doubt about it. And a lot of people gloss over that. They think it was just Hollywood celebrities who got targeted. They think it was, and the reason it was ended, the reason McCarthyism was ended was because the middle class was using it against the ruling class. Joe McCarthy accused the U.S. Army of being communist. There was a member of the U.S. Senate who committed suicide because he was being blackmailed about the fact that his son had been to a peace meeting or something. And that McCarthyism, it really started with the Democrats. It started with Harry Truman and the Democrats purging the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party. And in a lot of cases, it's actually pretty wild. It had an ethnic component, right? That in urban centers of the United States, and still to this day, right? In Chicago, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, New York City, a lot of the city government are Roman Catholic, right? That's true. I mean, it's just, a lot of the, a lot of the cops, a lot of the firemen, a lot of the judges are Roman Catholic, and they're Democrats. And the labor unions, and the labor movement in the United States, there were a lot of Jewish folks involved in that. And it was kind of a turf war in the Democratic Party, with the Truman wing of the Democratic Party that was very Roman Catholic, purging the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, which was very Jewish. And it was an ethnic conflict in a lot of ways. And you read a lot of the anti-communist rants from the Democrats who were pushing McCarthyism, and there was innuendo about Jews and stuff like that. In fact, Al Smith, who was the leader of the Democratic Party of New York City, he had denounced Roosevelt as a communist traitor. He'd started the American Liberty League, which was an anti-Roosevelt faction of the Democratic Party, and he was Roman Catholic. And that the Roman Catholic Church in the 50s was in kind of an anti-communist frenzy. And so you had the urban Catholic Democrats purging Jewish folks aligned with the labor movement and with the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, accusing them of being communists. However, after the 1949 revolution in China, after the People's Republic of China was established, at that point, it switched from Democrats, blaming other Democrats. I don't know who that is, Raphael, so I can't talk about it. I don't know who that is. And it turned into the Republicans saying that the Democratic Party was soft on communism. The rallying cry was, "Who lost China? Who lost China?" Was the rallying cry. They said that the Democrats, Harry Truman and Roosevelt, were Democrats, and they were soft on communism. They lost China. And they went after Alger Hiss. Do folks know the name Alger Hiss? Alger Hiss was a Roosevelt Democrat, basically, who'd been part of starting the United Nations. And they started this whole thing claiming he'd been a secret member of the Communist Party, and he had not been. And they started this whole campaign against Alger Hiss, that Alger Hiss was secretly, and Alger Hiss ended up going to prison for perjury. It was a whole wild case. The Republicans were calling the Democrats communists. And then Joe McCarthy emerged among the Republicans. Joe McCarthy emerged among the Republicans as this nut. But Joe McCarthy was a Republican, and he represented like middle class folks, doctors, lawyers, lower level folks. He wasn't a big money guy. He was in with some lower level capitalists. And he was speaking in West Virginia, and he said, "I have here in my hand a list of 51 employees of the U.S. State Department that are members of the Communist Party." The Communist Party. I mean, Joe McCarthy, he started using the anti-communism against people in his own party and against the U.S. Army and against, and it was almost like, it was like you had to do what he said he would call you a communist. And after Joe McCarthy was basically mobilizing against a lot of the ruling class with this, calling a lot of people in the ruling class, a lot of high-ranking members of Congress, and calling them all communists. And at that point, the mainstream U.S. media, Edward R. Murrow, they turned against Joe McCarthy. But there's another factor in breaking McCarthyism. A couple factors. First was the FBI discovered that it wasn't going to destroy the Communist Party. The FBI noticed that no matter how intense McCarthyism got, no matter how much they made these communists miserable, there was a layer of about 10,000 people who were going to stay in the Communist Party no matter what, right? That William Z. Foster was not going to be broken. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was not going to be broken. Who else? Eugene Dennis was not going to be broken. Paul Robeson was not going to be broken. And that there was a whole layer of people that, you could make it. A lot of people quit the Communist Party during that time, sure, right? But there was a layer of people in the 1950s that were going to stay in the Communist Party one way or another. So that was the first thing. The second thing was an international factor. Stalin died. Then Khrushchev came to power. Then Khrushchev hinted to the United States that he wanted to negotiate. Khrushchev was saying, look, Stalin, he was this wild anti-imperialist. The last speech Stalin ever gave was a global condemnation of imperialism. It was just amazing. The last speech that Stalin gave is a very powerful speech. Stalin died. And Khrushchev came into office. And you'll notice that, 1956 in the Soviet Union, you had the Party Congress, right? The 20th Party Congress, where, Khrushchev took a dump all over Stalin. He just gave this big, long anti-Stalin rant. After that, there was a feeling that Khrushchev might want to negotiate. So McCarthyism was broken by those factors. Khrushchev was coming in. He wanted to negotiate with the United States. The FBI discovered they weren't going to really destroy the Communist Party. And thirdly, the McCarthyism was being used by the middle class against the ruling class, right? And the John Birch Society, right? The crazy right-wingers of the early 60s, they were McCarthyists, and they thought the Rockefellers were communists, and they thought that all the major corporations in the USA were communists. There was a lot of weird middle-class libertarian elements that jumped onto McCarthyism to kind of mobilize against the ultra-rich in the United States, right? The Rockefellers, they believe in birth control. Everyone knows birth control is communist. Just, obviously it's not. It's funny, when I was in college, there was a used bookstore, and for like a nickel, I found a copy of a book called None Dare Call It Treason. None Dare Call It Treason. And it was this McCarthyist book. It was a little paperback that listed all kinds of institutions in the United States that it said were communist. The Methodist Church, because the Methodist Church had, opposed fascism. All right. So LaRouche, okay, and USSR. Opposed fascism, supported the Spanish Republic. It's pretty wild. McCarthyism is a definite, and it had an impact. You wouldn't have had the 1960s and the New Left without McCarthyism. And you wouldn't have had the neocons without the 1960s and the New Left. In my book on Kamala Harris, I talk about all of this, because there's a continuity to U.S. politics. McCarthyism was a reaction to the Popular Front and Roosevelt. The New Left was a reaction to McCarthyism. The neocons were a reaction to the New Left. And we're living now in a period that is very much defined by the failure of the neoconservatives. The neoconservatism was a very effective model for, running the United States. McCarthyism wasn't effective. It ultimately collapsed, right? It led to stuff the ruling class didn't want. The New Left was not effective because it ultimately led to, the political upsurge of the 1960s, the Black Panthers, etc. But the neocon model, from about 1972 until about 2006, 2007, the neoconservative model for managing the United States worked out very, very well. The neocon formula, the Cold War normal, the late Cold War normal, was a very effective way for managing U.S. society. It broke with the financial crisis. The Bush administration was the very end of neoconservatism, but that was kind of, the ruling class was figuring out, how do we manage the United States, post World War II? And they first tried McCarthyism. McCarthyism was moving towards some kind of fascism, but that was a disaster. It put a lot of the ruling class in danger. So then they tried the New Left, and the New Left, it had its results, but ultimately it spun out of their control with Students for a Democratic Society and the Black Panthers and all kinds of rebellions, and that didn't work. So then, neoconservatism worked very, very well, right? Neoconservatism was the model that held the United States together from the, starting in the 70s, early 70s, and the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And then it finally broke, right? And that the ruling class is constantly figuring out, how can they stay in power in the United States? How can they keep peace within their own class? How can they beat down countries around the world? How can they keep us rabble in line here in the United States? McCarthyism, the New Left, and the neocons and the late Cold War normal are all attempts to do that. And right now, Biden, you can be sure, Biden is trying to develop a new formula. How do we control the rabble? How do we make sure something like Trump doesn't happen again? How do we make sure no real socialism ever comes to, how do we control the rabble? They're trying to figure it out. So there you go. All righty. Enough about that. All right. Texas has definitely deregulated. That was the next super chat. Yes. Texas is a free market state, right? That's libertarianism. All the people that are freezing and starving, I can tell you who they can blame. They can blame Tom Woods. They can blame Julie Borowski. They can blame Ayn Rand. They can blame Ludwig von Mises. They can blame the Reason Foundation. They can blame the Cato Institute. They can blame libertarianism. Libertarianism, free market ideology and free market policies. No one owes you or your family anything. That is responsible for what's going on right now in Texas. The government has no obligation to you. You're on your own, right? Why should the government control the economy and take care of people? What are you, a communist? Stalin killed a gamillion people. So, yeah, and Texas, they've embraced that. It's funny, Rush Limbaugh, he died, and it's funny because I've been watching these liberal obituaries for Rush Limbaugh, and it's funny because Rush Limbaugh, you'd think that Rush Limbaugh never existed until Trump came along. I'm watching all these Media Matters and all this. It's Rush Limbaugh was a Trumper and he died. No, Rush Limbaugh was a neocon hack for most of his life. And Rush Limbaugh, he was around for decades and decades. Trump and Rush Limbaugh didn't, the Trump phenomenon, he was a Republican, he went along with it, but most of Rush Limbaugh's career had nothing to do with Donald Trump being president. Rush Limbaugh was in the 80s and the 90s, and Rush Limbaugh was awful in so many ways. There's so many things. One of the things he said on his program, I love this, because low-income people are obese, there's no poverty in the United States. Poor people are just lazy because they're so fat and they eat so much, right? Well, that was one. I heard it on the radio for years. He would say this, oh, did you know they did a study? Low-income people in the United States are obese. So clearly, because low-income people are obese, no one in America has ever been poor. Poverty is just made up by the liberals. Well, actually, if you look into it, the food that they have in low-income neighborhoods tends to be far worse for you than the food they have in the liberal community. Do you think that they have, that people in very impoverished neighborhoods are going to organic farms and shop? Give me a break. But Rush said that a lot of Rush's show was trying to reinforce in people's minds, nothing's wrong. Oh, poor people are obese, right? Or, what else did he do? Rush Limbaugh, one thing that he did, and he did to his credit apologize for this, but when he was first starting out, and this is vicious, ugly stuff that this man did, he would, when people died from AIDS, he would read their names on his radio program with an applause track, like he was happy that they had died from AIDS. Did you know that? That people would be dying from AIDS, and Rush would read their names with applause in the background. Now that is demented. That is deeply, deeply unhealthy. And he did apologize. I'll give him credit. He apologized for that. But yeah, Rush was awful. He was absolutely awful. But I will say that part of what made Rush Limbaugh effective was he really knew how that a lot of working class people are very, very off-put by the liberal, what do you call it? The liberal virtue signaling. You get this from liberals, this, oh, I'm so amazing, look at me, and he would make fun of the arrogance of liberals. And he did a very good job of that. And a lot of working people know that liberals are very phony. Liberals in the United States, Bill Clinton, people like that, they have a very phony character to them. But no, I'm reading you, I read you that statement from that mayor in Texas. That could be Rush. Rush could have said that. Rush may be dead, but that mayor of Colorado City who said, sink or swim, you don't deserve a handout, that could be from the Rush Limbaugh show. All right, there we go. In the United States, we're authoritarian and libertarian it's complicated, but, there's a huge amount of authoritarianism in the United States. But, we tend to have a libertarian economic approach. That's true. That's very true. Look, one thing that I think is kind of amusing is that, I've been to a number of countries that are described as authoritarian countries by the United States. And in everyday life, people have way more freedom. Right? For example, in Tehran, the capital of Iran. Iran is widely, in the United States, it's an authoritarian regime and all that. People in Iran, and it actually was a bit of a problem, would drive their motorcycles on the sidewalk. And so you'd be on the sidewalk, and all of a sudden you hear behind you, brum, and you'd have to jump aside as the guy on the motorcycle went by. You do that in New York City, you will go to jail. Okay? If in the United States, right, in New York City, biggest city in the United States, you had a motorcycle and you were riding it on the city, the cops wouldn't just stop you, they would cuff you. You would do jail time for that. In Iran, people do it all the time, no one says anything about it. No one cares. The police, it's technically illegal, and if the police saw you doing it, they would probably stop that. And you would have to stop. But people do it all the time. And I noticed that in a lot of countries that are considered to be very authoritarian, in everyday life, people are much more free to do what they want. We in the United States, we have more civil liberties, right? In theory, we're allowed to say what we want, right? We're allowed to protest, we can vote for different parties, but our everyday lives are much more highly regulated, right? In a lot of developing countries, you say, sexual harassment is not allowed on the job, In a lot of developing countries, they say, what is sexual harassment? They don't even know what it is. And if you told them what it is, they'd say, well, that happens all the time here. And that's not good. I don't think we should have sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is bad. But in the United States, it's much more regulated. In a lot of developing countries, right, people say transphobic things all the time. In a lot of countries that are considered authoritarian, people make rude jokes about people who are gender nonconforming, and no one says anything, and no one has an issue with it. Here in the United States, one could lose their job for it. It's kind of interesting to think about, but a lot of countries that are labeled authoritarian, it's they're authoritarian in the sense of there's not free elections, there's not freedom of speech, but in everyday life, people are much more free to live their lives. And because people are much more or less regulated, people in those countries have to be tougher. Right? Here in the United States, you're not allowed to get into a fist fight at school. I got into a fist fight when I was in school. I got suspended for a week from school when I was in 8th grade. If I had done that now, I would probably go to jail, but I was being bullied. This kid was bullying me, and he hit me, and I hit him, and we, everyone surrounded us and was watching us fight, and, we had a fist fight, and, of course, we got in trouble, and we got sent, we got kicked out of school for a week. Well, we were both suspended from school. We came back. That was the end of it. Nowadays, right, if that kid had hit me, all I would be allowed to do in school is throw up my hands and say, or else I would go to jail, right? They tend to put both kids in jail if there's a fist fight in school now. Well, and what this leads to is people that are pretty weak, ultimately, right? If you never are allowed to protect yourself, right? If you never are able to learn to be tough, then people, they do get weak. This is one weird grain of truth in what libertarians say. Libertarians, now I'm sure there's some libertarian watching this right now going, oh, see, he's saying that it's about making people dependent on the government. That's not what I'm saying, because I'm telling you, in countries where the state does control the means of production and regulate the economy, they don't put kids in jail for punching the bully after getting punched by him. You know what I'm saying? There's, and that, the amount of authoritarianism and rigidity in everyday life in the United States, compared to a lot of countries that are in theory more authoritarian, is very different. But anyway, enough about that. Someone asked me about my phrase, capitalism is not a conspiracy. I don't think it is. There are conspiracies within capitalism. Capitalists definitely conspire, right? That goes on. There are definitely individual capitalists who conspire to achieve their own ends. That happens. There are definitely conspiracies within capitalism. But all the ruling class are not on the same page. They have contradictory interests, right? And that's what people need to understand, is that, no, there's no, and that's the problem with a lot of the conspiracy narratives. The conspiracy narratives, the way they see it, all the ruling class are all in it together, and it's all just a big grand plot. And it's not that. In fact, if it was that, the world would be much more stable. It's not that. The problem with capitalism is that all the capitalists are trying to make their own profits, and their profits contradict the profits of other capitalists, and they're scrambling among each other. There are factions in the ruling class, there are different desires and needs on the part of the capitalists. Look, there are capitalists right now who are really suffering because of the power outages in Texas. Think about if you had a store, or you're going to lose out. But there are other capitalists who make money in other ways and might see this as a great opportunity to make some money because of the power outages in Texas. Not all capitalists have the same interests, and they use the state to try and regulate them, and that's what the struggle is. And Bonapartism is when one section of the capitalist class seizes control of the state and uses it to try and control other capitalists. And that's what Louis Napoleon was. That's what Hitler was in Germany. That's what Roosevelt was here in the United States. That's when there's a crisis of capitalism. You have capitalists who conspire to seize the government so they can control other capitalists. In good times, there's almost a consensus among the ruling class, right? Ronald Reagan used to say, we're all friends after 6 o'clock. But during a capitalist crisis, the capitalists start fighting with each other. Yes, there are conspiracies within capitalism, but capitalism itself is not a big conspiracy. And that is the weakness of capitalism. If it was a big conspiracy, it might work, but it's not a big conspiracy. Capitalism is the anarchy of production. It is the chaos of the market. Frederick Engels said that under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital, meaning that the capitalists are just trying to make money. And because of that, they can't really control their society. It's deeply irrational. All right. Someone asked me about, there's an organization of Filipino Americans here in the United States. Years ago, I went to many protests with them. I'm not in touch with them now. I don't know. Originally, they were kind of optimistic about Duterte, and so was I originally. I hoped that Duterte would come in and fix things up and improve things. Obviously, we've been disappointed by Duterte, but honestly, I don't keep in touch with that group. I don't know what they're up to lately. I was looking at their website the other day, and I haven't really been in touch with them. It's a big group of Filipino Americans that advocate like democratic rights and stuff in the Philippines, and I really haven't been keeping up with them. Somebody mentioned that we should call like this libertarian thought grime. That was kind of a joke. Well, I appreciate the joke, but I don't want to say anything that sounds close to the name of Skippy the Bear, because he's a fool. When he says I never criticize PragerU, one of my top videos is criticizing PragerU. When people lie, which Skippy the Bear frequently does, right? Says I've never criticized PragerU, says that I'm an anti-Semite, says that I'm just this evil transphobe. I mean, when people lie, you can't engage them, right? If someone honestly disagrees with you, like, Jason and I, we disagreed about the billionaires thing, so we had a conversation about it, right? Jason is an honest actor, and we disagree on many things, like China, etc. So I'll engage with Jason here and there, but this Skippy the Bear character, he lies. I have not seen any video he's ever made about me that has been in any way honest. There's always something out of context. There's always some attempt to distort my argument, distort what I've said. So you don't engage it. I mean, no, I mean, don't engage it. And he wants me to engage him, right? That's the other thing. A lot of times I noticed that, like, the last video where he said that, oh, he's never criticized PragerU, when I obviously have, that was bait. That was clearly bait, the way he was framing things. He wants me to make another video about him so that he can make another video about me. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I don't know why he's interested in doing that. I appreciate all the advertising he's given me. I really appreciate it. But no, I mean, when someone lies that blatantly, to say that I've never criticized PragerU, that I'm on here. I mean, one of his fans tweeted that I do nothing on these lives but rant against trans ideology. Is that what I do on these lives, folks? I mean, you watch me. Is that what I do? I just sit here every day. I'm just on here going, trans ideology, I can't stand it. Like, I barely touch on that issue. And when I do, I always make clear that I advocate the human rights of trans people. And that I'm against any form of bullying or discrimination against trans people, that I think that the way trans people are treated in this society is awful. They deserve our support, and that's it, right? But he's convinced his flock of supporters that I do nothing but get on here and, like, preach vicious hatred for trans people. It's just, when people are that dishonest, they are not worthy of your time. And there's other content. He's not the only one. There's some other creeps that have attacked me. And a lot of times the attacks are very, very, very juvenile. Like, they attack the way I look. They attack the way I speak. They attack aspects of my life story. What is it? And there's some creep who has theories about my sexual practices that are pretty funny, and has tweeted weird porno at me. I've got people that at one point they were saying that my dad is a Wall Street banker, which is hilarious. It's hilarious. I'm not going to tell you all who my dad is, but he ain't a Wall Street banker. I'll tell you that much. So these people, this is trolling, and you don't feed the trolls. And that's my advice to you folks. Don't feed these trolls. They're not worth it, right? The advertising is great. I mean, no attention. Attention is bad attention, as they say. But other than that, all right. Cool. All right. The Australian Facebook ban. David Fox, I saw that, and it seems like there is a real contradiction between Silicon Valley and the governments of the world, and that Silicon Valley and the Australian government have come to a point where they're clashing. And I want to see what the outcome of this is. I want to see how long this lasts. It's kind of amusing. I'm sorry that you're having to deal with that in Australia. It's certainly restricting your ability to access news and such on the internet. But, and again, this shows the interests of the ruling class are at odds. Right? If they were all in this together, there was some global cabal that were all in this together, you wouldn't have a situation like the Australian news Facebook ban. All righty, class reductionism. Well, look. There is a such thing as class reductionism. Okay, and the thing is, I've known about class reductionism for years, but it has nothing to do with what these idiots are saying it is. Okay? Class reductionism, great example of it. There was a certain communist group that I will not name here in the United States that, in a lot of ways, I would argue that their position on a lot of issues is class reductionist. For example, one thing that they will chant at their rallies is, white power, black power are the same. Racism is the boss's game. White power, black power are the same. Well, that's class reductionism, because it's not true. Black people fighting for their rights and talking about black power and white supremacists are not the same, okay? The Black Panther Party and the KKK are not the same. Black power and white power are not the same. They're not. However, if you are a class reductionist, if you don't recognize the history of what black people have been through, if your line is just, hey, it's all about class, right? Only the workers versus the bosses, that is a class reductionist perspective. So yes, there is what you can call class reductionism. Great example was Libya, right? When the USA was attacking and bombing Libya, many Trots and Trotskyites said, oh, I'm not for Gaddafi. He's a capitalist. It's not a real socialist country, so I don't support the people of Libya fighting the U.S. imperialists. I am for neither the USA or Gaddafi. I want workers' revolution in America and workers' revolution in Libya. Well, no. When the U.S. imperialists are attacking and bombing and destroying a country, as a socialist, it is your duty to stand against that and be an anti-imperialist. And no saying, oh, Gaddafi is a capitalist, he's not a real socialist. Again, that's class reductionism. Now, what these people think class reductionism is, these people think that class reductionism is anyone who ever talks about class. That's really what they think. That's what they think. Anyone who talks about class is a class reductionist. There are these, clearly there are, there are class issues. I mean, economics is the essence of Marxism, clearly. But according to these people, no. Anyone who talks about the class struggle, anyone who fights for the working class, that's class reductionism. And basically, it's a demand that nobody not be a liberal, right? They want you to be a liberal. Whatever liberals are upset about, white fragility, whatever liberals are talking about today, that's what you talk about. And if you talk about the workers and the bosses, if you talk about economics, well, then you're a class reductionist and you're a bad person. And that's basically and it's a demand. You are not allowed to not be a liberal. You must be a Rachel Maddow, folks, right? You can call yourself a socialist, sure, but, look, the internet is full of people whose politics consists of they're pro-trans and they think Republicans are Nazis. Well, I don't think Republicans are Nazis. I don't. I mean, there may be, fascistic elements among, conservatives, but I don't think Republicans are Nazis, number one. Number two, I mean, being pro-trans is fine, but there's a lot more to Marxism, than that. But there is this collection of people on the internet who not only do they think that all it means to be a communist or a socialist is hating Republicans and thinking Republicans are Nazis and being pro-trans, but on top of that, if you believe in anything other than that, they declare you to be a crypto-fash Nazbol. And it's stupid. There's a super chat here. It's called, I guess I didn't write the whole thing down. It said, should communists, and it's blank. I apologize. Who asked that? Because I want to give you an answer. It said, should communists, and then it's blank. I forgot to write the rest of it down. So what is it? Does anyone care to share with me what that super chat said? Because I want to give you an answer. Should communists go to Texas and organize? Very good. Thank you, Chaya, for telling me the rest of your super chat. Sorry about that. Of course, communists should be everywhere. Everywhere. Right? Everywhere the working class is, but especially when the working class is suffering. Look, we need to get out of the movement and get to the masses. Get out of the movement and get to the masses. That has been my mantra. And we need to not be attached to the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party's apparatus. Look, folks, there's a certain communist group that won't be named, and this just tells you, exactly the problem, all right? There's a certain Marxist-Leninist faction, very small, a little collection of people, and when Donald Trump got elected, they had a demonstration on Inauguration Day, big banner, defeat the Trump agenda. Now, I think a lot of the Trump agenda should be defeated, such as anti-immigrant bigotry, such as demonizing Muslims. But what about the end the wars part of the Trump agenda? No. What about the rebuild the United States and its crumbling infrastructure part of Trump's agenda? Yeah. What about the stabilize the economy? No. They had a rally when Trump got elected called Stop the Trump Agenda. So basically, all the workers who voted for Trump because he said he was going to stop the wars, did they go to them and say, well, we want to stop the wars too? But no, they just said, we want to stop your agenda. All the working people who voted for Trump because he said he was going to rebuild the country economically and raise it, stop. No, they basically stopped the Trump agenda. So now that Biden has won the election, they didn't protest the inauguration. Why would they do that? But there's going to be a rally in, I forget what city. And they're having a rally, and they're calling their rally Welcome Biden. Welcome Biden. And it's welcome him and present to him a list of the people's demands. There's not a single criticism of Biden in their statement, but their rally, they have a list of things they'd like him to look into, like police brutality and all of that. Well, that's nice that they're even confronting him with demands, because I know a lot of communists and socialists wouldn't even do that. But it's like you're blatantly taking sides. Okay? I mean, and they say, well, we're not for Biden or Trump, we're for socialists. And yeah, if defeat the Trump agenda. They forgot something about the mass line, exactly. Defeat the Trump agenda versus welcome Biden, here are some of our demands. You know, you're taking sides. And it's one thing when you're taking sides, right? Trotskyites want to be like, you're breaking the class line. That's not the point. When you do that, you are basically saying to any working class person who voted for Trump because they thought he would end the wars, or voted for Trump because he said he was going to reopen the auto plants and the steel mills, voted for Trump because he said he was going to make America great again and end their economic suffering, you are giving them the middle finger. That is all you are doing. You are giving them the big middle finger. You're basically saying to all the workers who, for progressive and confused reasons, voted for Trump, screw you. That's basically what you're doing. So 74 million Americans who are confused, a lot of them are racist, they're wrong, okay? But some of them, there are some progressive aspects of the Trump program, like ending the wars, like wanting to alleviate the economic suffering of working class people. And No, they just give them the middle finger. And when it really gets down to it, the reason that this particular communist group is doing that, and they don't want to admit that's what they're doing, there's a reason they're doing that. It's because their whole strategy is to get inside the NGOs and get inside the labor bureaucracy. And I'm sorry, but the NGOs, the George Soros NGOs, and the labor bureaucracy, Peace Action, and they're not going to make a revolution. We need to get to the broad masses of people, the broad masses of working class people. You need to get to the broad masses of people. I made a video directed at Trump supporters, and members of this organization accused me of being a fascist and a Nazbol or whatever for making it. For months I've been harassed by these people, and for years really, and it's like it's a hustle. Okay, let's be real. For a lot of these socialist groups, it's a fucking hustle. Sorry to excuse my language. It's a hustle. All right, progressive politics is a scam. It's a hustle. It's about how can we bring in some of the money, how can we maneuver into, how can we set up the stage, how can we get the permit to have the rally, how can we get our members to get the good paying union bureaucracy jobs, how can we position ourselves to be in charge of some NGO. It's not about actually getting to the masses and making socialism. It's not about doing that. It's about playing a bureaucratic game and trying to maneuver within the liberal apparatus set up by the ruling class for their own ends. Okay? And I am sick and tired of that. And I spent years in a socialist group, years, watching this and just being in shock. These people don't want socialism. They are the socialist movement, and they don't want socialism. They want a good position within the progressive wing of American politics. That's what they want, and it's horrifying to me. I was in a meeting one time, and I had just met with someone who was joining this organization I'd been in, and the person in the group said to me, what's the plan for making a revolution? Well, I reported back to the senior leaders of this communist group I was in. And they laughed. I used to ask that when I was a kid. That's funny that he would ask that. Oh, my youthful naivete. No, if you're a socialist group, you should have a plan for getting to socialism. But no, these people have been hustling for so long. Trying to be king of the protest cage, trying to get some union bureaucracy money, trying to get the grant money from the... They've been hustling for so long that they found it humorous that this young man I was meeting with would actually want to know how we might actually get to socialism. Another occasion, I was very angry about the Bernie Sanders campaign. I was a little bit ultra-left, honestly. But I was very angry about the Bernie Sanders movement. And I said, all these people, I said to a leader of this socialist group, all these people that are rallying around Bernie Sanders should be rallying around us. We should be the ones, let me teach you Spanish, Caleb, thank you. We should be the ones, bringing socialism to the broad masses of people. They shouldn't be getting it from Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is doing what we should have been doing. And I remember the leader of this group, this woman laughed at me. You think we could ever be as popular as Bernie Sanders? That's ridiculous. I said, excuse me, aren't we supposed to be trying to take power? Except they're not. They're hustling. They're hustling, okay? A lot of what calls itself socialism and communism in the United States is hustling, okay? It's movement hustling. They are trying to make a buck by maneuvering within the movement. And it's the same people, and it's the same stupid game of musical chairs. They're trying to get this job and this job. Go to the Left Forum, and it's the same people that have been there for decades and decades, fighting with each other, maneuvering, trying to take over the community radio station, or trying to, maneuver inside the union bureaucracy. It is the saddest thing. Meanwhile, there are millions and millions and millions of Americans who've never met a communist, have no idea what communists believe, and are economically suffering and are mad at the system. And instead of going to these people and showing them that socialism is the answer, the left has decided, oh no, we're just going to keep trying to be king of the protest cage. Well, I say, out of the movement and to the masses. Out of the movement and to the masses. Out of the movement and to the masses. I am sick and tired of people playing this stupid game. And instead, we need to get to the masses. And that's the point of the Center for Political Innovation, is to get to the masses. Get to the masses. All righty. Alrighty, what else we got here in terms of super chats? All right, have I seen the documentary Black in the USSR? I have not seen that documentary. I have read a lot about African Americans living in the USSR. I assume that's what the documentary is about, but I haven't seen that particular one. There were a lot of Black Americans who moved to the USSR. There were many, French Revolution. There were many Africans who moved to the USSR. The Soviet Union had a lot of ties to many African countries, so I assume that's what it's about. A person asked about the repression of communists in Iran. Well, you have to remember, in any revolution, okay, it's not clear when it's over, right? In Iran, they overthrew the Shah, and Khomeini and the Islamic Republic came to power. And there were some Iranian communists who thought that, the revolution would keep going to communism. That didn't happen. Khomeini and the Islamic Republic, they were in power. But then Iraq invaded, okay? Iraq invaded Iran. And Iraq was a Ba'athist Arab socialist country, and it was aligned with the Soviet Union, had a lot of Soviet weapons. So on that basis, there was a feeling that the communists were a big threat to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, many, and the Islamic Constitution of Iran, look, if you don't recognize the Islamic Constitution, you can't be a political party in Iran. Now there are, many people in Iran that are heavily influenced by Marxism. Marxism is widely studied in Iran, and people know about it. But yes, in order to be a legal political party in Iran, you have to recognize the Iranian Constitution. In Iran, at the time of the revolution, there were 3 communist factions in Iran. The first was called the Tudeh Party, and that was the main communist party. The second was called the Fedayeen, and those were guerrilla warriors. They were like Maoists and Guevarinists that were trying to wage like a guerrilla war in the countryside. And there was the MEK, which is the Islamo-Marxists, and they were this weird religious Islamo-Marxist cult. So the Tudeh Party dissolved. It dissolved, but there were a lot of people that were in it that continued to be part of the Islamic Republic, that continued to guide the Islamic Republic and push for anti-imperialism within the Islamic Republic. The Fedayeen, they surrendered. They were at war with the government, and some of them continued to be at war with the government and supported Iraq, and some of them didn't, and there's that. Mujahideen Khalq, they worked for Saddam Hussein during the Iraq-Iran War, and now they work for the neocons. Now they're neocon Republicans. Rudy Giuliani speaks at their events. So yeah, I mean, it's not as simple. The person who asked the super chat, they gave one version of events, and they said one thing. There was heavy repression, just like after the Bolshevik Revolution. There was heavy repression of the left, of the anarchists and Kronstadt and all that. And that often in a revolution, you get contending factions. Well, Khomeini was the figure who represented, at that point, what most Iranians who wanted to topple the Shah believed. And so the Khomeini faction, they were going to become the new government, and they are the government now. And there was a lot of confusion about it. And there was some pretty brutal repression that went on. But you have to remember, Iran was being invaded by Iraq. Almost 1 million people died. Chemical weapons were used. So, these are circumstances, again, revolution is not a dinner party, as Mao said. And on top of that, you don't want to live in a violent revolution. This is what I've been trying to tell people so often. Like, you don't want to live in a violent revolution. You really don't want to live in a violent revolution. Violent revolutions are pretty ugly and chaotic and miserable, okay? A lot of awful things go on, All sensible people would prefer a peaceful transition to socialism. The question is that possible or not? Will the capitalists allow it? The communists never advocate a violent revolution. The Bolsheviks, after the Russian Revolution, they implemented the death penalty for drinking alcohol. Did you know that? Because so many people were drinking and partying after the revolution that they were not able to mobilize effectively to defeat the White Army. So they had to institute the death penalty for drinking alcohol. That's pretty awful. I can't ever imagine being in a situation where I would shoot somebody for drinking alcohol. But that was a military situation where they were under attack. They were facing all-out bombardment. So, we Western leftists, we project, right? We fantasize. Well, if it was me and I had been the leader of the Iranian Revolution, what I would have done. No, you wouldn't. You don't know that. You've never been in those circumstances. I never have been. You never have been. So we can learn from the Soviet Union, their accomplishments. We can learn from Iran and their accomplishments. We can learn from China and their accomplishments. But we other than that, we can't really, their experience and our experience is very different. And we should not project. We shouldn't try to glorify what they've done. Thank you, Cam. We shouldn't try to glorify what these countries have done and pretend it was just clean and nice and friendly. Number one. And number two, we shouldn't try to pretend like that what they're doing is a guide for what we're doing, because what we advocate here is very different. We're in a country that's already industrialized. Capitalism is pretty well deindustrializing it. But these folks have made revolutions on the basis of extreme poverty and scarcity. And yeah, so there you go. Saddam Hussein repressing the Kurds. Well, I mean, there were civil wars, and Arab socialism is Arab nationalism. It does advocate for the Arab people. The Kurds are not Arabs, and I don't like to see ethnic conflicts of any kind. I wouldn't want anyone to be persecuted on the basis of their ethnic group. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of that. Not a big fan. Alrighty, the origins of crack. Well, Nicaragua, right? The United States was arming the Contras to fight against the Sandinistas, right? The Nicaraguan anti-communist army, the counter-revolutionaries, the Contra forces were fighting against the Sandinistas, the Contras, and the Contras were heavily involved in the drug trade, and it's widely acknowledged that the Contras were involved in synthesizing cocaine into crack. So, there's a lot about Gary Webb. You can read all about the CIA drug connection. But yeah, in the 1980s, the U.S. government was arming a lot of terrorists in Latin America to fight against communists. And a lot of those terrorists were also drug dealers. And that's crack's origins. Does the FBI track Marxist books today? Well, they don't talk to me about it. Sorry, Io. Maybe. I don't know. Who knows? And the thing is, they don't have to ask you. They don't have to ask you. They don't subpoena you. They subpoena Amazon. And Amazon, has a cooperative relationship with U.S. law enforcement and with the Pentagon. Amazon designs some of the Pentagon software. So, Yeah, you don't have any privacy nowadays. Anything you do online, the government knows about, or could know about. Maybe they're not watching you, but you have no privacy on the internet. Whatever you do on the internet is not private. So if you're doing it on the internet, it ain't private, and that's that. There's no reason to be overly paranoid. The government is not going to come arrest you for watching my lives. There are millions of people with dissident thoughts. Jakarta method. So I'm not saying that, basically in this age of information technology, we do not have the privacy we once had. I've interviewed people from the LaRouche group before. They're great folks that are dedicated to the Belt and Road. They support the Belt and Road. They're not Marxists. They reject Marxism, and I've argued with them about that. But I think they're good people. They have good intentions. They have a very strange history, and I don't want to get into that. I don't think they're Nazis. I don't think they're fascists, just like I'm not. I think that they have their beliefs. Some of their beliefs are very right-wing and conservative. Some of their beliefs are very left-wing and progressive, and they're their own group, and I respect them. I think they're good people, but I don't agree with them. I'm a Marxist. They reject Marxism, and I do not. And they were very supportive of Donald Trump. I am not. I don't think Donald Trump was a good guy. They were very much of the opinion that Donald Trump represented hope for U.S. politics. That was not my view. But I don't like the way they've been canceled, and I don't like the way I've been canceled, and I don't like the, I don't like this atmosphere where you're not allowed to talk to certain people. I will interview them. I interviewed Daniel Burke, who's one of their members in New Jersey, and I would happily have him on again. And I've interviewed other members of their organization. Their views are different than mine. But whatever, and that's that. And, that's that. I don't agree with them. They don't agree with me. But we can work with each other. This is real politics. See, in real politics, people who don't agree with each other can sometimes engage, right? I think a lot of what they publish about China is very good. A lot of what they publish about Russia is very good. They do a lot to follow the space program and things like that. But I think a lot of their analysis of Trump and his role in U.S. politics was very wrong. And I'm not, I'm not as socially conservative as they are. I would say they're quite socially conservative, and I'm not, right? But that's that. That's their business, and they have the right to be who they want to be. And people shouldn't harass them, and people shouldn't call them fascists, and people shouldn't call them Nazis. I don't think they're anti-Semitic, So I just, whatever. They're themselves, and I have no shame about the fact that I've been to a few of their events, that I've talked on the phone to some of them, and I've had coffee with them a few times. But we don't agree, and that's that, and that's all there is to it. And I'm never going to endorse them because I don't agree with them, a number of things they've said over the years, and they're never going to endorse me. They don't agree with a lot of things I say on here, on these lives and all of that. So that's that, and there's no scandal here. And if you, and I don't like this cancel culture. Right? This idea that, oh my God, we're supposed to cancel them. Some stuff happened in the 70s, okay? Some stuff happened in the 70s. Back in the 1970s, communist groups in the United States fought each other, okay? The Maoists, right? A lot of the Maoist groups, like the Revolutionary Union and the October League and the Communist Workers' Party, they thought the Soviet Union was the main danger to the people of the world, because that's what China said. And there would be rallies in New York City to support Nelson Mandela. And the Communist Party USA and the Workers' World Party, they were big supporters of Nelson Mandela. Well, China didn't support Nelson Mandela during the Mao years in the early 70s, because China felt that the Soviet Union and Nelson Mandela were Soviet imperialists. So China backed a group called the Pan-African Congress, the PAC. Well, there were times where there were rallies to support Nelson Mandela, rallies against apartheid, and Maoists showed up with baseball bats and weapons and joined with black nationalists to attack those rallies and beat up Nelson Mandela's supporters. That's wrong, but it happened. Does that mean that I would never talk with any Maoist who ever did that? No, I would tell them that wasn't the right thing to do. There were Trotskyites who used to, disrupt other people's events. In the 70s, the communist movement, there had been this huge upsurge of civil rights activism and anti-Vietnam War activism. Huge upsurge. And then things started to decline, right? The late Cold War normal set in, and things started to decline. So these groups started to blame each other for it. They started fighting each other. These communist groups, fought each other. And, in some cases they came to blows. In some places people were injured. I think there were probably incidents where people were killed. That's not good. Communists shouldn't be killing each other. Communists shouldn't be fighting each other. I'm against that. But, people who want to make it like the LaRoucheites, were the only group doing that back then. That's not true. Yes, the LaRoucheites, did they get into fistfights with people? I mean, according to everything I've read, yes. But so did the Communist Party, and so did the Socialist Workers' Party, and so did the Revolutionary Union, and so did the Workers' World Party, and so did the October League, and so did the Spartacist League. And unfortunately, communists and leftist groups back in the 70s were fighting each other. Back then, the LaRoucheites considered themselves to be, a communist group. They don't anymore. Their views have changed a lot since the 70s. But, I mean, I don't know. I wasn't alive back then, and, whatever. I don't, and again, right? I mean, it's kind of like Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Was there heavy repression of communists? Yes. Does that mean that I should support the U.S. imperialists against the Iranians? No. Does that mean I can't acknowledge the progressive things about Iran? Look, this is what people need to understand. In the real world, in real life organizing, cancel culture doesn't work. You have to be able to associate with people with whom you disagree in real politics, in real life. And I mean, the Nation of Islam, I don't agree with them. I think that the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers were not particularly fond of each other. But I look at the role the Nation of Islam plays now, their anti-imperialist work, their solidarity, and I think the Nation of Islam is a progressive force in the United States. I don't agree with them. They don't agree with me. That's okay, right? I mean, again, if you want to just be on the internet your whole life, fine. But in the real world, sometimes you have to enter a strategic alliance with people. Sometimes you have to negotiate and compromise, okay? That's all there is to it. All right? Okay. Did the fall of the USSR begin with Khrushchev? No, I think that the fall of the USSR was the result of a lot of problems that had developed in the Soviet Union. There was a lot of weaknesses in the Soviet Union, but it was overwhelmingly a result of the fact they were under attack. Those weaknesses in the USSR, the bureaucratism, the depoliticization of the population, all of that was a result of the fact the Soviet Union was never given a moment of peace. Never did the imperialists allow them to peacefully develop. They had World War II, they had 15 countries invade them after the revolution, they had sanctions, they had a cold threat of nuclear war. Never did the Soviet Union get a moment to just, never did the imperialists say, okay, just do your thing, Soviets, we'll leave you alone. Never. They were constantly under attack, they were constantly bombarded, and despite that, they carried out and achieved miracles, eradicating illiteracy, industrializing the whole country, defeating the Nazis, inventing space travel. In spite of everything they were up against, they achieved miracles. But in the process of facing an onslaught and a bombardment from the imperialists, they became a very bureaucratic and militarized society out of necessity. And Zbigniew Brzezinski and the CIA were able to manipulate and maneuver some of those bureaucratic weaknesses to ultimately, lead to a situation that resulted in the fall of the Soviet Union. Didn't start with Khrushchev. I mean, you could say it started with Lenin. I mean, this is what happens, and it's a tragedy. But that doesn't mean we can't acknowledge the great things the Soviet Union did. So there you go. Should communists read Hegel? Read Hegel. Next question. All right. Did the fall of the USSR begin with Khrushchev? I already did that. Okay. French Revolution. What about it? It was a bourgeois revolution. It was to tear apart feudalism in France. It was an explosion. I've written about it in my Kamala Harris book. I talk about how the legacy of the French Revolution kind of lives on in some of the socialist movements. A lot of the atheism in socialism is rooted in the French Revolution. A lot of the appealing to people's impulses, the drive for sexual freedom and such is rooted in the French Revolution. That in a lot of ways, the French Revolution was appealing to people's sexual desires, and they're unleashing their issues of aggression. I talk about Sigmund Freud's analysis of the French Revolution. And it's all in my Kamala Harris book. But the French Revolution was progressive. I mean, they overthrew feudalism. But it did not create an egalitarian society. I mean, it created a capitalist society. Socialism as a movement and Marxism emerged in the aftermath of the French Revolution because the bourgeois French Revolution did not achieve what it set out to achieve. And so the question was, how could we create a society that was fair and just? How could we continue to march into the modern world? And Marx was a left Hegelian, and the left Hegelians emerged as a movement of people who were, saw the aftermath of the French Revolution, were disappointed. So that's, there you go. I don't know what the Jakarta thing, I don't know what that is. Okay. Should Marxists read Hegel? Sure. I mean, you should understand Marx's background. Marx was heavily influenced by Hegel. So yeah, if you want to understand where Marx came from, I would not be opposed to reading Hegel. Hegel is widely studied by Marxists. Hegel was not a Marxist. He was a huge influence on Marx. He developed a very strong notion of historical progress. He is responsible for the concept of the dialectic. But Hegel, Hegel, he was not a Marxist, but he was a big influence on the Marxist movement. So I think that wraps it up, folks. That's all for now. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.